In May of 2013, on a cold and windswept beach in the county of Norfolk, England, the sea did something it had done thousands of times before. A storm rolled in off the North Sea, the tide pulled back hard, and the waves stripped away a layer of sand that had been sitting on that beach for who knows how long. Underneath that sand was something nobody expected to find anywhere in Britain, let alone on a public beach where dog walkers and tourists stroll every single day. Underneath that sand were footprints. Not modern footprints, not the footprints of some Roman soldier or Viking raider or medieval farmer. These were footprints so old that when scientists finally worked out their age, the number was almost impossible to process. Somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million years old. Let that sit for a second. Not 800 years, not 8,000 years, 800,000 years, give or take, and possibly closer to a full million. To put that into some kind of perspective, modern humans, the species you and I belong to, Homo sapiens, have only existed for around 300,000 years. So whoever left these footprints walked across that muddy riverbank roughly 500,000 years before our own species even existed. And the strange part, the part that turns this from an interesting archaeological footnote into something genuinely unsettling, is that scientists still cannot say for certain who or what made them. This is the story of the Happisburgh footprints, named after the tiny village of Happisburgh on England's eastern coastline, a place slowly being eaten away by the sea, and in the process, giving up secrets that had been buried since before the Ice Ages began. It is a story about a family, or what looks very much like a family, walking together across a riverbank at the edge of a vanished world. It is a story about a species of human that is not us, that is not the Neanderthals, that vanished from the historical record so completely that most people have never even heard its name. And it is a story about how close we came to losing this evidence forever, how a 2-week window of exposed mud on a British beach became one of the most important archaeological discoveries in European history. Let's start with the beach itself, because the location matters more than you might think. Happisburgh sits on the Norfolk coast, a stretch of England that has been losing ground to the sea for centuries. It is one of the fastest eroding coastlines in the country. Houses that once stood safely inland have literally fallen into the sea over the decades as cliffs crumble away. For most people who live there, this erosion is a slow-motion tragedy, a constant loss of land, of homes, of history. But for archaeologists, that same relentless erosion has become an accidental gift. Every time a chunk of cliff collapses or storm strips away a layer of sediment, it exposes something that has been hidden for hundreds of thousands of years. It is like the coastline is peeling back the pages of a book nobody thought still existed. Archaeologists already knew Happisburgh was special before the footprints turned up. Since around 2005, teams working the site had been pulling ancient flint tools out of the sediment, hand axes and flakes shaped by deliberate human hands. And these tools were already forcing scientists to rewrite the timeline of when humans first reached northern Europe. Before Happisburgh, the accepted wisdom was that humans didn't make it this far north until much later because the climate would have been brutally cold, more like modern-day Scandinavia than the mild England we think of today. But the flint tools at Happisburgh, combined with fossils of ancient plants and animals found in the same layers, pushed the date of human presence in Britain back by at least 350,000 years earlier than anyone had previously believed possible. So the site had already rewritten history once. Nobody expected it to do it again, and in such a dramatic, visceral way. Then came May 2013. A team from the British Museum, the Natural History Museum in London, and Queen Mary University of London were surveying the shore as part of an ongoing research project when they noticed something strange in an exposed patch of dark silt, roughly the size of a small living room, about 12 square meters. Scattered across this patch were a series of shallow hollows and depressions. At first glance, they could have been almost anything. Puddles left by receding water, marks made by driftwood rolling across the mud, random pockmarks from centuries of tidal action. Nobody wanted to jump to conclusions, because claiming you'd found human footprints nearly 1 million years old is not something you say lightly in serious science. Nick Ashton, an archaeologist from the British Museum who ended up leading the study, described the moment perfectly. He said that at first they weren't sure what they were looking at, but as the team carefully removed the remaining sand and sponged away the seawater pooling in the hollows, the shapes started to resolve into something unmistakable. Elongated, asymmetrical, with distinct variations in depth that matched the pressure points of a human foot, the heel strike, the ball of the foot, in some cases even the individual toes. These weren't random marks. These were footprints. And here is where the story becomes a genuine race against time. The team knew immediately that this discovery was not going to last. These prints had survived for the better part of 1 million years buried under protective layers of sand and sediment, shielded from the erosive power of the sea. The moment they were exposed to open air, to wind, to the relentless washing of the tide twice a day, they were doomed. The clock was ticking, and it was ticking fast. Ashton and his colleagues had roughly 2 weeks before the North Sea would erase this evidence permanently, washing it away just as easily as it had exposed it in the first place. So they moved fast. Rather than trying to physically extract or cast the footprints, which would have been slow, difficult, and risked destroying the delicate impressions before they even got the chance, the team used a technique called photogrammetry. In simple terms, this means taking hundreds, sometimes thousands of overlapping photographs of a surface from different angles, and then using specialized software to stitch those images together into an incredibly detailed three-dimensional digital model. It is a bit like giving the footprints an eternal life in data form, even after the physical prints themselves are gone forever. Working against the tide, sometimes literally sponging seawater off the mud between shots, the team managed to capture the entire surface before the sea reclaimed it. And within about 2 weeks of their first appearance, the footprints were indeed washed away completely, never to be physically seen again. If that team had been a few days slower, if a storm had rolled in a week earlier, this discovery might never have happened at all. We would have simply lost it, the same way the sea has quietly erased who knows how many other traces of ancient life along that same coastline over the centuries. Once the digital models were analyzed properly, the picture that emerged was extraordinary. The researchers identified around 49 individual footprints, and based on the range of sizes and shapes, they concluded these prints were made by at least 5 different individuals. This wasn't a single person wandering alone. This was a group, and the size variation told a story of its own. Some prints were large, consistent with an adult male. Others were noticeably smaller, suggesting they belonged to women or to children. In fact, by carefully measuring the length and width of each print, the team was able to estimate the height and even the approximate body weight of the individuals who made them, using the same biomechanical principles that let modern forensic scientists estimate a person's build from a single shoe print at a crime scene. What they found was a group of what appeared to be one adult male, along with several smaller individuals, who most likely included women and children, possibly even very young children. Isabel de Groot, a specialist in ancient human remains who worked on the analysis, described the pattern of movement captured in the footprints as looking like a group that was, in her words, pottering around, the kind of unhurried, meandering movement you'd expect from people foraging for food, rather than fleeing from a predator or marching with purpose toward a destination. This wasn't a hunting party moving with tactical precision. This looked like a family ambling along a muddy riverbank, possibly searching the mud and shallow water for edible plants, shellfish, or whatever else the environment offered that day. Researchers have since suggested it might not be too much of a stretch to call this a family group, given how the individuals appeared to be moving together in the same direction, at a similar unhurried pace. Now stop and actually picture this for a moment. Nearly 1 million years ago, on a landscape that would have looked nothing like modern England, a small family group walked along the edge of a river. Children's footprints sit next to an adult's. They weren't rushing. They were simply living, doing the same basic thing families have done for the entirety of human history and prehistory, foraging together, moving together, existing together, on the edge of a river that has long since vanished from the map. Scientists believe this ancient river may actually have been an early version of the Thames, following a course completely different from the one it takes through London today, before shifting its path due to massive glacial activity in later ice ages. The world these individuals inhabited would have been almost unrecognizable to us. This was not the England of green rolling hills and mild winters. This was a landscape of open grassland and river valleys, populated by animals that sound like they belong in a completely different continent. Bison thundering across the plains. Mammoths, ancient elephant relatives covered in shaggy fur, grazing near the water. And perhaps most surprising of all, hippos and early forms of rhinoceros wading through what is now the English countryside. It's genuinely difficult to reconcile that image with modern Norfolk, but the fossil record from Happisburgh backs it up completely. The climate during certain windows of this period was actually warmer and more temperate than you'd assume, closer to something you might find in parts of Africa today, before the deep freeze of subsequent ice ages locked much of northern Europe under ice sheets for tens of thousands of years at a stretch. So who exactly were these people? This is where the story takes its strangest turn, because the honest answer is that we don't fully know, and we may never know for certain. What we do know is that these footprints predate every species of human we typically think of when we picture our ancestors. They are far older than Homo sapiens, our own species, which didn't emerge until roughly 300,000 years ago in Africa. They are also older than the Neanderthals, who appeared in Europe around 400,000 years ago and eventually went extinct roughly 40,000 years ago, not long after modern humans arrived on the scene. The leading theory, put forward by Professor Chris Stringer of the Natural History Museum, one of the world's foremost experts on human evolution, is that these footprints were likely made by a species known as Homo antecessor, sometimes nicknamed Pioneer Man. This species is known primarily from a site in Spain called Atapuerca, where fossilized remains dating to a similar time period have been unearthed. Homo antecessor is a genuinely fascinating and somewhat mysterious branch of the human family tree. Based on the fossil evidence, these individuals were surprisingly similar to modern humans in overall height and build, fully bipedal, walking upright with a gait not drastically different from our own, which actually lines up with how modern the footprints themselves appear when analyzed. And yet, Homo antecessor is not a direct ancestor of modern humans in any simple sense. It represents a separate branch, a population that appears to have thrived in parts of Europe for a stretch of time, before vanishing from the fossil record entirely by around 600,000 years ago. According to Stringer, the species appears to have been replaced in Europe by another human relative, Homo heidelbergensis, who in turn were eventually followed by the Neanderthals around 400,000 years ago, and then finally by our own species, Homo sapiens, arriving in Europe roughly 40,000 years ago. So what we're looking at, potentially, is a lost branch of humanity. A species that walked upright like us, cared for its children like us, foraged together as a family unit like us, and then simply disappeared from history, leaving behind almost no trace except for a handful of fossilized bones in Spain and a set of muddy footprints on an English beach that were only visible to human eyes for about 2 weeks in the year 2013, after remaining hidden for the better part of 1,000,000 years. And here's a detail that makes the whole thing even more remarkable. Preserved footprints like this are almost unbelievably rare in the fossil record, far rarer than bones or stone tools. Bones and tools are solid, durable objects that can survive burial and fossilization relatively intact. Footprints, by contrast, are essentially just an impression in soft ground, something that, under normal circumstances, would be washed away, blown away, or simply collapse within days or weeks of being made. For a footprint to survive at all, an extraordinarily specific and lucky sequence of events has to happen. The ground has to be exactly the right consistency, wet enough to take a clear impression, but firm enough to hold its shape. Then, almost immediately afterward, that surface needs to be covered by a protective layer of sediment before wind, rain, or tidal action has the chance to erase it. And then that protective layer needs to remain undisturbed for potentially hundreds of thousands of years, all while the surrounding geological forces that reshape entire coastlines and continents continue grinding on above it. It is an almost absurd chain of coincidences, and it is exactly why footprints this old are found in only a tiny handful of locations anywhere on the planet. Before Happisburgh, the only footprint sites of comparable or greater antiquity anywhere in the world were located in Africa. The most famous example is Litoli in Tanzania, where footprints dated to roughly 3.5 million years old were discovered, attributed to a much earlier and more primitive human ancestor, Australopithecus afarensis, the same species as the famous fossil skeleton known as Lucy. There are also footprint sites at Ileret and Kubifora in Kenya, dated to around 1.5 million years old. Until Happisburgh, nothing of this age had ever been found outside the African continent. This makes the Norfolk footprints not just old, but historically unique. They are, to this day, the oldest hominin footprints ever discovered outside of Africa, and the only early Pleistocene-era human fossils of any kind ever found in the United Kingdom. When you consider that the entire history of human presence in Britain had to be rewritten because of a handful of stone tools found at the same site years earlier, and then rewritten again because of these footprints, it becomes clear just how significant Happisburgh really is, not just for British archaeology, but for our understanding of human migration across the entire planet. There's also something worth pausing on regarding what these footprints reveal about the biomechanics of whoever made them. When researchers analyzed the pressure distribution and structure captured in the prints, they found something surprising. The prints showed a clear arch, similar to the arch found in modern human feet, along with heel and toe impressions, consistent with a fully modern style of upright walking. T. This might not sound like a big deal on the surface, but it actually carries real scientific weight. It tells us that by this incredibly early point in human evolutionary history, whichever species left these prints had already fully developed the same walking mechanics we use today, the same weight transfer from heel to toe, the same arch supporting the foot structure. Evolution had already solved the problem of efficient bipedal walking long before our own species even existed. In a strange way, if you compared a Homo antecessor footprint from 800,000 years ago to a footprint left by someone walking on that exact same beach today, the fundamental mechanics of the stride would look remarkably similar. Different species, separated by the better part of 1,000,000 years, and yet the basic act of walking upright across wet mud looked nearly identical. It's also worth addressing something that makes this discovery a little bittersweet. Unlike bones, which can be excavated, preserved, and studied for decades or even centuries after their discovery, these footprints no longer physically exist. The sea that exposed them also destroyed them, exactly as the research team feared it would. Within roughly 2 weeks of that first storm uncovering the silt layer, subsequent tides and weather had worn the surface back down to nothing, erasing physical evidence that had somehow managed to survive completely intact for the better part of 1,000,000 years, only to vanish forever within a fortnight of being seen by human eyes for the first time since it was made. If it were not for the quick thinking of the research team and their use of photogrammetry to capture a full three-dimensional digital record before the tide finished the job, this entire discovery might have existed only as a rumor, a handful of blurry photographs, and a lot of scientific regret. Instead, thanks to that digital model, researchers, and eventually the public, can still study and even virtually walk through a recreation of that ancient riverbank scene, examining the depth and shape of every single print in detail, long after the real thing has washed out to sea. The discovery was formally published in the scientific journal PLOS ONE in February of 2014, and it made headlines across the world almost immediately, largely because of just how strange and evocative the story is. Newspapers ran headlines calling it the million-year-old family, and for good reason, because there is something deeply, almost uncomfortably relatable about this discovery. We are used to thinking about deep prehistory in terms of abstract fossils, isolated bones in museum cases, remote and difficult to connect with on any emotional level. But footprints are different. Footprints are behavioral evidence. They capture a literal moment in time, an actual walk taken by actual individuals on an actual afternoon, however many hundreds of thousands of years ago that afternoon happened to be. You can look at the spacing between the prints and get a sense of stride length, of pace, of whether someone was walking briskly or ambling slowly. You can see where a child's smaller footprint sits alongside an adult's larger one and imagine, whether or not it's scientifically provable, some kind of parent walking beside their child along a muddy riverbank, searching for food, just trying to get through another day of survival in a world dominated by mammoths, bison, and roaming rhinos. And this is really the emotional core of why this discovery resonates so strongly, even years after it was first announced. It's not just about pushing back a date on a timeline or reclassifying a species. It's about the sudden, visceral realization that whoever these individuals were, whatever species they technically belonged to, they were still recognizably a family, doing recognizably family things, on a landscape that has long since disappeared beneath modern England. Chris Stringer put it well when he said that these footprints provide a very tangible link to our forebears and to our deep past. And that word tangible is doing a lot of work there because so much of what we know about deep prehistory is abstract, inferred, pieced together from fragments and educated guesses. But a footprint is different. A footprint is proof that someone, or something very much like us, stood in that exact spot, put their weight down, and took a step forward. There's one more layer to this story worth sitting with, and it's the uncomfortable truth that Homo antecessor, the species most likely responsible for these footprints, no longer exists. It isn't our direct ancestor in any simple linear sense. It was a branch of the human family tree that thrived for a period, adapted well enough to walk upright with essentially modern mechanics, raise children, foraged in family groups, and then, for reasons scientists still don't fully understand, disappeared from the fossil record entirely within a few 100,000 years. Climate shifts, competition from other emerging human species, changing food availability across Ice Age Europe, any or all of these factors likely played a role. But the species itself, along with whatever culture, whatever spoken communication, whatever inner lives its individuals may have had, is simply gone. All that remains, nearly 1,000,000 years later, is a scattering of fossilized bones in a Spanish cave, and a handful of footprints on an English beach that existed in the open air for barely 2 weeks before the sea swallowed them for the second and final time. It's a strange kind of legacy, not a monument, not a written record, not even a complete skeleton, just footprints. Impermanent by nature, meant to disappear within hours under normal circumstances, and yet somehow preserved by an almost impossibly specific set of geological accidents for the better part of 1,000,000 years, only to be found, studied, digitized, and then lost again, all within the span of about 2 weeks in the spring of 2013. Since the initial discovery, research at Happisburgh has continued, with archaeologists hopeful that further erosion of the coastline might eventually expose more evidence, whether that's additional footprints, fossilized remains of the individuals themselves, or signs of a more permanent living site nearby, given how much this single stretch of Norfolk coastline has already rewritten our understanding of early human migration into Europe. Twice over now, first with the stone tools and then with the footprints, it's entirely possible the sea still has more secrets to give up. Every storm that batters that crumbling coastline is, in a strange way, both a slow tragedy for the people who live there and a potential doorway into a deeper and more textured understanding of who walked this land long before recorded history, long before agriculture, long before even our own species existed. So the next time you're walking along a beach anywhere in the world, take a second to think about what might be underneath your feet. Not just sand and rock, but potentially layers upon layers of forgotten time, each one holding the faint, fragile possibility of a footprint left by someone who was not quite human the way we understand humanity today, but who was close enough, human enough, that when scientists finally uncovered their trail across an ancient English riverbank, the only word that truly fit what they were looking at was family.